Hello, my name is Dr. Anna Bull. I'm a founder and co-director of the 1752 Group, and we're a research and campaigning organisation that addresses sexual misconduct in higher education. And I'm also a senior lecturer in education and social justice at the University of York. So today's session is the flipped learning part that introduces the idea of professional boundaries ahead of a workshop that you're going to have with your fellow postgraduate researchers or supervisors in your department, school, or research group. So the goal of the workshop in general is to devise a set of shared professional boundaries that you'd like to uphold as a community. And the idea is that through separate sessions with PGRs and with supervisors or academic staff, you'll be able to get a sense of whether you have shared professional boundaries, and hopefully you'll then be able to feed into institutional work on professional boundaries to make sure that your voices are heard. Many of you probably already have a working understanding of professional boundaries, whether that's from previous careers and other sectors, from your work in higher education, or just from your day-to-day interactions with other people in your department or discipline. And in this workshop, we're going to think specifically about professional boundaries in academia. And so for those of you who are postgraduate researchers, this is useful not only during your PhDs, but also for developing professional skills for when you move into academia. Into leadership or management roles, for example, as well as for working in other sectors outside academia. Hopefully you will have had some support resources for your institution or department circulated ahead of the workshop, or that these will be circulated at the end of the workshop. So there should be support available if there's some issues that come up in this material that makes you recognise and reflect on your own experience differently. Okay, so first of all, what are professional boundaries? Here's a definition from social work. The term professional boundaries denotes appropriate standards of behaviour by professionals working with adult clients or patients in occupations such as healthcare, therapy, or social work. You notice that actually they don't mention higher education, but I think you can adapt this definition to think about higher education or any sector where there is a professional relationship of authority, trust, or dependency between two adults. Many professions actually have codes of conduct that, if violated, can lead to a professional losing their license to work in that field. In higher education, we actually don't have anything comparable, despite the fact that abuses of power can be very harmful. So professional boundaries are important for a variety of reasons in higher education. First of all, they're about clarifying what the relationship involves and what the priority is in a relationship between, in this case, a PGR and their supervisor. So in a position where one person, the student, the patient, the client, is made vulnerable by being in a position of less power because they have less knowledge or less experience or less access to academic resources, this is about clarifying what their relationship is. In higher education, it's a way of saying we're going to prioritise the teaching and learning relationship, your career development as a PGR, rather than prioritising any other way of relating to each other. The second way professional boundaries are helpful is if people are targeted for harassment or abuse, it helps to label and recognise these behaviours. In my own research in this area, particularly some groups of students such as international students, people from working class backgrounds who don't have any family or friends who've ever been to university before, they just assume that whatever their professor or lecturer does is normal and is acceptable. But they have no idea what is normal in this context. So if a professor says, let's have our supervision in the pub, and plies them with alcohol, they have no way of knowing whether that's acceptable or not, or if they are able to raise concerns or say no to such requests. So having explicit discussions about professional boundaries makes it clear that what is okay and what is not okay, and that means that people can raise concerns if they are uncomfortable. A third way it's important is to have clear professional boundaries is to help students and staff, in fact, who have had their boundaries violated in other contexts to feel safer. So anyone who's suffered any form of abuse prior to or while attending higher education will hopefully be able to have more trust in the teaching and learning relationship if they know what to expect and they know what is expected from them. Boundaries can also help staff by preventing burnout, setting boundaries in terms of office hours, email response times, how much pastoral support you can offer, how much time you can spend with students will hopefully support staff health and well-being. It's also helpful to model boundaries for students who go on to teach, not only in higher education, but also in other contexts. So even if it's not explicit, students will be learning from your approach to boundaries. Professional boundaries help with building and maintaining trust of students so that they know what to expect from staff. And so the consistency of staff holding the same boundaries across a department or a school is really, really important because then students know that they can expect the same things from all staff. And finally, professional boundaries contribute towards a more inclusive and equal environment. Because different groups of students, in fact, have different attitudes towards professional boundaries, and some groups of students actually prefer to have clearer professional boundaries, as I'm going to show you now. This is from data from a study that I carried out, and data was collected in 2018 in partnership with the National Union of Students from 1,500 students across the UK, so a mix of students at different levels of study, not just PGRs. We asked about a whole range of different professional boundaries. We found very clear gender differences in how comfortable students felt with different types of interactions with staff. Now, there's an academic journal article out in the Journal of Further and Higher Education, which you can look up if you're interested to read more about this, or you can read our report, Power in the Academy, from 2018. But just to give you a brief highlight of some of the findings from the survey, the figures in blue or purple combined are those who are uncomfortable with certain types of relationships between staff and students. So we found staff having sexual relationships with students. You can see on the left that women were much more uncomfortable than men with staff having sexual relationships with students. But even when we come to things that aren't sexual, but what we called personal interactions, one example might be arranging a supervision or tutorial meeting at the supervisor's or staff member's house, you can see that women are still substantially more uncomfortable than men with this. And you can see that the majority of women, in fact, in this study were uncomfortable with it. So that's just a little snapshot, but it's not just gender differences that we found where there were different levels of comfort. We found women respondents were more uncomfortable than men with a range of sexualized and personal interactions. And you might want to think about why that might be. But actually, there were some surprising findings. Between postgraduate and undergraduate students, there were no significant differences in attitudes. And we had a larger sample of postgraduate students because we wanted to explore their attitudes in particular. And we didn't find any differences in attitudes towards professional boundaries. But there were differences across racially minoritized groups. Black and Asian students said they were more uncomfortable with personal interactions with staff than white students. And so personal interactions included a scale of types of blurred boundaries that were not sexualized, such as being sent private messages on social media by their lecturers, getting drunk with lecturers, or going to the pub. So actually, racially minoritized students wanted kind of clearer professional behaviours from staff. So a similar version of the study was repeated by the Office for Students in 2023. They reached very, very similar findings to us with a slightly adapted scale, and that's available in the notes that go with these slides if you're interested to look at more about this. So professional boundaries are an issue for inclusion across different groups of students. Okay, so now moving on to developing a shared understanding of professional boundaries within your department or context. You're going to move on to discuss some scenarios with your group or some examples of professional boundaries and discuss what you would feel comfortable with and what you think would be appropriate. So here's some points that I want you to reflect on in your discussions, as well as thinking about these points about inclusion, that different groups are more or less comfortable with different behaviours. But secondly, think about, will simply prohibiting behaviours in policy lead to change? So if you say, okay, I don't think we should have supervision meetings at a supervisor's house, if you put that in a policy, is that sufficient to actually bring about change? So again, looking at social work, which is the discipline, the area where a lot of research or more research has happened in this area, they've found that simply writing in a policy doesn't lead to change. Who would have thought? Because staff might not be aware of the content of policies or might not understand the reasons for behaviours being prohibited. So actually, as well as, yes, we do need to have policies in this area, I think, but we also need to practice exercising ethical decision-making around boundaries. And this is something that, I'm sure you're already doing every day or every week. But in this workshop, we're kind of making it explicit. And so the idea is to make it explicit what you're thinking about when you make these kind of small everyday boundary decisions, and to help to develop a reflexive awareness around boundary or power issues. So basically, instead of memorizing all the rules to follow and making sure that you've printed out the policy and got it on your door and you're following it all the time, which obviously is not a bad idea, but rather we want to gain an underlying sense of the principles around where we should reflect, where we should seek advice, where we should check the policy, or take other steps to ensure that our approach is appropriate. It's not going to be possible to specify in a policy every possible scenario that might happen. So that's another reason why we shouldn't try and spell everything out in policy, but actually we should work on developing a shared understanding and a shared ethical sense. Staff will already be applying their understanding of professional boundaries, but there might not be a shared or explicit agreement. So supporting a positive culture across your department requires having this discussion together and making sure you're all on the same page. This will also help make it visible where somebody or some members of the department might be not aligned with the rest of the department. And then new issues will arise. So the use of WhatsApp is coming up a lot. And so professional boundaries should continue to be under regular discussion in the department or in your context. And I think it's important to comment that having very, very strict boundaries is not always necessary or appropriate. We've got to balance an understanding of what's appropriate boundaries and what's going to serve the students' teaching, the students' learning, alongside creating community, keeping yourself safe, being inclusive. So it's always this balancing process. So you don't have to always immediately go to the strictest possible option. But the scenarios that you can talk about are a way of kind of practicing that ethical decision making, and most importantly, making sure that that's a shared decision. So the next step for you will be to have a discussion in a workshop setting with your colleagues, with your co-PGRs, and start to think about what this looks like in your department. Thanks and bye.